for media attention and for standing in the polls. We're in love with polls in America. We take polls every 5 minutes of our campaigns. In fact, sometimes I speak to audiences abroad and they say, why even bother holding the election? You hold so many polls anyway, it shouldn't matter. But that means everything is infused with politics. And that includes foreign policy. But I don't think foreign policy is primarily shaped by politics. Of course, everything is influenced by politics. Remember what I said. For the most part, day-to-day conduct of foreign policy is not noticed by the American people. I do think, presidents try to get big successes and big failures, and avoid big failures, but beyond that, I think foreign policy tends to be more ideologically driven. You saw a different foreign policy under Bush than under Obama because they have different views of the world. Republicans and Democrats have different views of the world as well as different views of domestic policy. Moreover, what is really interesting about American politics, as I said, the American people, like people most around the world, tend to look at their home situation first and foremost. But if you're a president, you have much greater freedom to act in foreign policy than you do in domestic policy. Because to do anything in domestic policy, you've got to get through the Congress. And we can have, under our system, and we have it right now, a president of one party and at least one chamber of our Congress controlled by the other party. Today our lower house is controlled by the Republican Party and our president is Democratic, different from a parliamentary system. So to get something done domestically, you got to go through Congress. And right now, Barack Obama can get nothing through the lower chamber, but he can still do a lot in foreign policy. So we have the great irony in America is presidents come into office primarily on domestic matters, but tend to have greater freedom of action in foreign policy.
The next question is from Jalpa Bhatt. Democratic and especially some Republican candidates will benefit massively from the new legislation that permits them to receive unlimited and unaccounted fundings. Does this mean that a significant shift of political power to the very moneyed interests that earlier elections have tried to contain in the U.S.?
So, very knowledgeable question. It wasn't an act of Congress, but it was a decision of our High Court, the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically interpreted the Constitution in two ways. Our First Amendment says everyone should have freedom of speech. And it has interpreted freedom of speech broadly to include spending money on a political campaign. By anybody, not just by candidates. You're protected under the Constitution. Secondly, it has interpreted corporations to be a kind of person, with corporations and unions as well having free speech rights. You put the two together, and then who asked this question? Where?
Please stand up.
Incredibly knowledgeable question. And as she correctly points out, this has enabled unions and corporations to pour unlimited amounts of money into presidential campaigns. Just one family, the Koch brothers, who run Koch Industries, they're conservative, they've already poured tens of millions of dollars of their own money into the campaign. But I don't think it's going to make a difference. And the reason is the big money has already been incredibly influential in our politics. Even before this decision came out, Barack Obama spent $750 million on the last campaign, a lot of it coming from the big interests. And the same thing is true at every level of politics. This is one of the biggest problems of American politics. We don't have a lot of overt, open corruption. Public officials are not often bribed. We don't bribe voters very often. But we have a tremendous influence from big corporations and other special interests because of the money they legally give in campaigns. So what this new decision is going to do is simply increase what has already been a big problem in American politics, the influence of big money. The only answer, in my view, which would require amending the Constitution and would require politicians to do what they don't want to do, is to ban private money entirely and just have total public financing. That's a fantasy. It's not going to happen. My other idea is just forget about any kind of regulation that doesn't work, but have total disclosure. So everyone has to disclose where their money is spent. We have a big thing in America. One of the biggest sports is called NASCAR, auto racing. And millions of people go to see auto races. Tens of millions watch it on television. And the drivers wear these special suits to protect themselves from getting burned. And they have on their suit all of these patches from their sponsor, General Motors, Honda, Suzuki. So my reform is to have every candidate put on their business suit all their sponsors, ExxonMobil, General Motors, Steelworkers, so you know exactly who's backing them.
The next question is from one Mr. Deepak Zala. If you could raise your hand, you are there on the right for you. His question is, incumbent politicians have a host of advantages in US elections, much like they do in India and most parts of the world. Given that the US is a mature democracy, do you think there should be election rules that the higher percentage of voting or some other mechanism to balance the unfair advantage of the incumbent?
Well, you're absolutely right. I'm not sure it's unfair, but we can. That's a judgment. But factually, you're absolutely correct. Incumbents have big advantages. People know who they are. They can, gain the attention of voters. They have established supporters and established fund-working networks, which is why one of my keys is whether the incumbent party candidate is the sitting president. It's actually the sitting incumbent, because that's an advantage. That's one of the keys to the White House. And it's even more of an advantage, by the way, in other elections, because everyone's going to know who's running for president. Everyone's going to know about Mitt Romney. But if you're challenging an incumbent for a seat in Congress or a state legislature, you have a big issue in getting yourself known. So one reform is the one I've suggested: get rid of private money and have incumbents and challengers funded equally. Some in America have adopted something called term limits. The president can only serve 2 terms, and in some places, members of the state legislature can only serve 2 or 3 terms. So that's another reform that people have advocated. Personally, I don't favor that, and it's not constitutional on the federal level. I think the best reform is total public financing of campaigns, which will at least somewhat equal the playing field. But you can never completely equal it. An incumbent is an incumbent. And by their very nature of being in office, they are going to have an advantage. It's a tough thing, being a challenger, but having everyone funded equally would help an awful lot.
This is from Mr. Harpal Dave of CEPT University. Okay. What about the promises that the government of Mr. Obama has not been able to keep, like closing down Guantanamo Bay? All this, does it all get reflected in all the keys?
It certainly does get reflected in the keys. Look, no president fulfills all their promises. I don't care if you're Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or Franklin Roosevelt. You're a human being. You got to deal with Congress. As I said, you got to deal with the bureaucracy. You got to deal with public opinion. Things can happen abroad over which you have no control. No president ever comes close to fulfilling their promises. He's fulfilled some, like health care reform, stimulating the economy, not fulfilled some others, as you mentioned. But if they're big enough and the disappointment is great enough, it will be reflected in the keys. Key number 2, no serious contest for the incumbent party nomination. Sometimes, when there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the president, he'll get a challenge within his own party. For example, in 1980, Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, was the president, and a lot of Democrats were unhappy with him. And he was challenged by the most famous Democrat in the United States Senate. Anyone know who that was? Ted Kennedy, the brother of the assassinated president, John F. Kennedy. and that contributed to Jimmy Carter's defeat. Or a third party. If people are dissatisfied enough, they might form a third party, or social unrest. They might protest in the street. See, this is the beauty of the keys. All of these things that we can talk about, and are ideas, if they're big enough, they will turn a key. If they're not big enough, they won't. So the keys are a mirror of all of these unquantifiable things that we've been talking about.
This question is from Amrish Majumdar. Could you please raise your hand? Okay. In this campaign year, Pennsylvania proposed a new plan that would change its representation in the Electoral College from a winner-take-all model to district-by-district model.
Yes, the problem with that is, who's going to be the first of a big state to do that? If Pennsylvania does that, no one's going to care about Pennsylvania, because they're going to know the Democrats are going to win the Democratic districts, the Republicans are going to win the Republican districts. So maybe a few districts will be up for grabs. So Pennsylvania, instead of having 15 electoral college votes, winner take all, whoever wins Pennsylvania wins 15 electoral college votes, there may only be 3 or 4 at stake. So why bother with Pennsylvania? You'd rather go to Florida, which is winner take all, and whoever wins gets 27 electoral college votes. That's what happened in 2000. George W. Bush won Florida by 537 votes out of 6 million votes cast in Florida, but he won all the electoral college votes. So while that may be an interesting reform, it's going to be very, very difficult for any major state to adopt it, because it would make that state less important in the presidential election. That's why it's been proposed in California, it's been proposed in Pennsylvania, but none of them have done it.
The next question is from Jitishri. Okay. In 2011, several states enacted new laws that the Democratic Party attacked as attempts to improve the Republican Party presidential prospects. Issuing of IDs, barring of ex-felons, making early voting periods shorter. Do you see this as a trend to disenfranchise core voter blocks such as liberals, college students, blacks, and others?
Can you stand up, please? That's an unbelievably knowledgeable question. Shows really deep knowledge about American politics, and it's absolutely true. Can we drop the PowerPoint U.S. presidential elections? Is that possible? I want to show you something on this PowerPoint that goes right to the heart of your question, and it's some really important information. The PowerPoint's called U.S. elections. We go right to the end of that PowerPoint. I think that's the information. All the way down. Not this one, the other PowerPoint, called U.S. elections, not keys. That's it. Yeah. I think it's on this PowerPoint. Stop! Back up. There we go. Everybody thinks, or a lot of people think, I've heard this a lot in India, that the American electorate, the American people, are not divided the way perhaps the Indian electorate is along religious and other lines. That's absolutely false. American voters vote very differently depending upon their race and religion. This is just the votes for Obama in 2008. So it indicates what kind of people tend to vote Democrat. Look at whites. Only 44% of whites voted for Barack Obama. The majority of white people voted against him. Look at black people, though. The next one. 95% of black people voted for Obama. Look at Latinos. 66% of Latinos. Look at Asian Americans. 61%. Look at young people. 60%. Go down to the bottom. Jews, 78%. But white evangelical Protestants, strong white Protestants, only 25%. So there are